August 17th, 1942 began like so many others grey, damp, heavy with the unspoken dread that clung to every convoy crossing the North Atlantic, but by mid the sky had sharpened into a cruel metallic blue, the kind that makes the sea glare like broken glass. And it was under that pitiless sun that Billy MacLeod, 19 years old, humming Loch Lomond, as he always did, while coiling signoir on the aft deck, became the last boy I would ever see die smiling. For just moments before the Focke-Wulf condors appeared, low and silent, against the western horizon, their black crosses stark as wounds against the sky, the ship erupted into chaos. Claxons shrieked, anti-aircraft guns roared, and the air filled with the acrid stench of cordite and burning paint. Yet through it all, I remember Billy turning toward the wireless cabin, raising a hand not in fear but in that easy, familiar wave he'd perfected over months at sea, as if to say, "Don't worry, Ellis, I'll be fine." And then the bomb struck not with a single explosion, but with a series of shuddering detonations that seemed to tear the very fabric of the ship apart, swallowing the mast, the signal deck, and Billy in a single blinding bloom of fire and shrapnel that left behind only smoke silence and the terrible groaning of stressed steel as the Blackwood listed to starboard, wounded but not yet broken. When the smoke cleared enough to see, I found him pinned beneath a twisted spar near the wreckage of the aft lifeboat, his left leg mangled beyond recognition, his face pale as chalk, but his eyes wide with a lucidity that defied the blood soaking through his uniform. And though his lips moved with difficulty, I heard him whisper my name not as a plea, but as a trust, pressing into my hand a damp, crumpled envelope already stained with sweat and something darker. Its address smudged but still legible: Molly MacLeod, 42 Kelvin Street, Glasgow. And his final words, spoken with a calm that haunted me long after he fell unconscious, were not of pain or regret, but of love. "Tell her I wasn't scared," he said, as if that were the only truth worth preserving in a world that devoured boys like him without ceremony. And I stood there clutching that fragile scrap of paper, feeling its weight, not as mere ink and pulp, but as a living pulse, a final testament from a soul who had faced the abyss and chosen tenderness over terror. That night, as the ship limped toward safer waters under a sky salted with stars, Billy succumbed to the fever that crept through his veins like a shadow, and though the chaplain offered the usual prayers, and the crew observed the customary silence, I remained in the wireless cabin, headphones clamped uselessly over ears that heard only the echo of his voice, staring at the letter as if it might dissolve into the lamplight, knowing even then that this was no ordinary correspondence, but a sacred thing, not a map of troop movements, nor a ciphered warning, but a heart laid bare in ink, a confession of love written with the quiet certainty of one who knew he would not live to see dawn. And when Lieutenant Commander Hayes summoned me the next morning with the Admiralty, Isse Col Decree Order 114B, mandating the immediate incineration of all unvetted personal effects from deceased personnel, deemed potential risks to morale or security, I understood with a sinking clarity that the Navy did not fear espionage in this letter, but humanity itself, that it sought not to protect secrets, but to erase the very vulnerability that made men like Billy more than just numbers in a logbook. So I wrote a counterfeit, hollow thing filled with patriotic platitudes and dutiful farewells, the kind of letter the bureaucracy would approve, and handed it over without flinching, watching it vanish into a file marked "processed," while the true letter still bearing the faint trace of Billy's blood near the fold, I hid first in the lining of my sea bag, then beneath a loose floorboard in my bunk, then finally sewn into the inner hem of my tunic, a secret heartbeat against my ribs. And though I told myself I would send it to Molly when the war ended, when the world was safe enough for grief, the years unfolded like charts on a plotting table, each one carrying me further from Glasgow and closer to a life that demanded I forget. I could not, for every time I imagined her opening it, her hands trembling, her eyes filling with a kind of sorrow that hollows a person from within, I faltered, paralyzed, not by cowardice, but by a reverence so profound it felt like sacrilege to disturb her peace with my survivoress guilt. Thus I carried it through the rest of the war, through demobilization, through marriage and fatherhood, through decades of ordinary days. They could never erase the extraordinary weight of that single page, for it was not merely a letter, but a covenant, a silent vow between the dead and the living, and though the Admiralty had ordered me to erase him, to reduce Billy MacLeod to a name in a ledger and a file in an archive, I chose instead to keep him alive in the only way I knew how, not with monuments or medals, but with memory, with a quiet, daily act of refusing to let his final truth be consumed by the machinery of war, even if it meant bearing the burden alone, for sometimes the most dangerous act of resistance is not to shout, but the war ended not with a thunderclap, but with a slow, exhausted sigh, the kind that lingers in railway stations and quiet kitchens and the empty chairs of men who never came home, and, though a return to civilian life, as Thomas Ellis, schoolteacher, husband, father, I never truly left that August afternoon in 1942, for Billy's letter remained with me like a second pulse beneath my skin, tucked not in a drawer but in the silent chambers of my conscience, where it gathered no dust but only weight, a weight that deepened with every birthday Molly might have celebrated, every spring in Glasgow when the cherry blossoms bloomed along Kelvin Street, every time I heard Loch Lomond played on a pub piano and felt the ghost of a boy who believed love could outlive war. For years, I told myself I would send it when the time was right, when grief had softened into memory, when I could look Molly in the eye, and not see accusation in her gaze. But the years passed, like convoys vanishing over the horizon, and in 1959, long after I had stopped imagining her face, I opened the Glasgow Herald on a rainy Tuesday, and found her obituary nestled among the quiet announcements of ordinary deaths. Margaret Molly Ferguson, née MacLeod, survived by her husband Thomas and 2 sons, and in that moment, the letter ceased to be a promise and became a relic I had no right to disturb, for she had lived the life Billy had wished for her, had married the kind baker from Duke Street, had built a family on the foundation of a peace he never saw, and to intrude now with his final words would have been not an act of remembrance but of selfishness, a way of easing my own guilt at the cost of her family's quiet closure. So I buried the clipping with the letter in an old tobacco tin beneath the floorboards of my study, thinking that perhaps silence was the final gift I could give them both, whose love deserved to rest undisturbed, and Molly, whose happiness I had no right to shadow. And for a time, it seemed enough, until Clara, my daughter, now grown and studying history at Edinburgh, found the tin while helping me sort through old papers in the attic. And though she did not open it without permission, she brought it to me with eyes that held not curiosity but reverence, as if she already sensed the gravity of what lay within, and when I finally allowed her to read it, she did so in the lamplight of our sitting room, her silence afterward more eloquent than any words, until at last she said, "He trusted you with his heart, Dad, and you kept it safe all these years. That wasn't betrayal, that was devotion." Her words unraveled something in me I had long believed was sealed shut, and a year later, without asking, she traced Thomas Ferguson to a cottage outside Paisley, where the old baker, now bent with age, but sharp of mind, listened to Billy's story not with jealousy but with a sorrow so gentle it seemed woven from the same thread as love. And when Clara placed the original letter in his hand, stained Segredie, read it slowly, touched his lips to the paper as one might kiss a relic, and whispered she never spoke of him, but sometimes, on winter nights, she'd hum that song. Now I know why. And in that moment, I understood that I had not failed Billy by keeping his letter. I had honored him by refusing to let it be reduced to a bureaucratic footnote, for memory is not measured in timeliness, but in fidelity, and some truths are meant to be carried until they find the hands that can hold them without breaking. When Clara published her small book decades later, weaving Billy's story into a tapestry of wartime letters, preserved against official erasure, readers wrote to us from across the world, veterans who wept for boys they'd forgotten, widows who recognized their own lost loves in his words, children who finally understood the silence of their fathers and, through them, Billy ceased to be just my secret, and became part of a larger truth. That war may demand we become machines, but peace begins when we remember we are human, when we choose to keep what the world tells us to discuss, when we honor not only the grand acts of valor but the quiet, trembling courage of a boy who, facing death, chose to speak of a dress at a summer dance rather than the terror of the abyss. Today, at 93, my hands tremble and my eyes blur, but every Sunday I take down the framed copy of Billy's letter, now preserved behind glass, its edges softened by time, and I read it aloud. not as a confession but as a benediction, and I finally said the words I owed him all those years. I told her, Billa, I told her you weren't scared, and I told her you loved her until the very end. And though Molly is gone, and Thomas is gone, and even Clara's hair is silver now, the letter remains, not as a wound, but as a witness, a testament to the fact that the Navy could burn paper but not memory, that orders can erase names from files but not from the hearts of those who chose to remember, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act in a world built on destruction is simply to keep one fragile truth alive, not for glory, not for history, but because someone once trusted you with it, and you loved them enough to say yes.